The bus was packed, the air thick with the usual mix of tired commuters and chatter. Among them sat an elderly woman, her hands clutching a worn-out grocery bag as she gazed out the window. She had seen a lot in her time, good and bad, but what was about to happen next still managed to surprise her. A group of teenagers sat a few rows away, laughing loudly, their voices cutting through the quiet hum of the ride. One boy, in particular, seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. He slouched in his seat, feet propped up, his words dripping with sarcasm and mockery. Then, his gaze locked onto the elderly woman, and a smirk stretched across his face. "Hey, Grandma, why don't you just stay home? You're taking up space," he jeered, his friends stifling laughter. Others on the bus shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to hear, others waiting to see what would happen next. The old woman turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes with a calm, knowing stare. But instead of anger or embarrassment, there was something else, a quiet confidence, almost as if she had seen this before. The teenager expected a meek reaction, maybe even silence. But what he got instead was something he would never forget. What happened next left the entire bus in stunned silence. And by the time it was over, the boy's laughter had vanished, replaced with something he never expected: respect. Stay tuned, because this lesson is one he, and everyone watching, won't soon forget. The bus rattled along the road, its engine humming beneath the weight of its passengers. The air inside was thick with unspoken tension, the laughter from the group of teenagers still echoing in the minds of those who had witnessed the scene. But the elderly woman remained composed, her wrinkled hands resting lightly on her lap. She had seen arrogance before, cruelty even, but something about the boy's taunts didn't just reek of disrespect, it carried something deeper. The teenager leaned back, his smirk widening as if he had just won some invisible battle. His friends snickered beside him, one nudging his arm as if to egg him on. But before he could say another word, the old woman did something unexpected. She smiled. Not the kind of smile that came from amusement, nor one that concealed anger. It was a knowing smile, one that held the weight of years, of wisdom, of stories untold. And then she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You remind me of someone I used to know," she said, her eyes never leaving his. The boy raised an eyebrow, scoffing. "Oh yeah? Some other old person you used to bother?" His friends chuckled, but there was something uneasy in their laughter now, a hesitation. They weren't sure if they wanted to continue the joke or step back. The passengers, too, seemed to lean in, sensing that something more was unfolding. The woman shook her head, her smile never fading. "No," she replied. A boy who thought the world owed him something. A boy who believed he was untouchable. The bus lurched forward as it hit a pothole, but inside, the tension remained unshaken. The boy folded his arms, feigning indifference, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes: curiosity, maybe. "Yeah? And what happened to him?" he asked, sarcasm still laced in his tone, but quieter now. The woman sighed, as if recalling a memory buried deep within. "He learned. The hard way." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for the first time since the encounter began, the teenager hesitated. His friends shifted uncomfortably, the game they had been playing no longer fun. But he wasn't ready to back down. "Oh please," he scoffed. "What kind of lesson could change someone like that?" The old woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharp, as if she could see through him. "He lost something. Something he could never get back." The boy frowned. He wasn't sure why, but the way she spoke sent a chill down his spine. The bus continued down the road, the cityscape blurring past the windows, but inside, the space felt smaller, more intimate, as if time had slowed. A man sitting nearby, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Maybe you should listen, kid. Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn." The teenager turned sharply, his bravado flickering. "Who asked you?" The man shrugged. "No one. But you should ask yourself why you feel the need to tear others down just to feel bigger." A few of the passengers murmured in agreement. The boy clenched his jaw, his friends shifting beside him. The energy had shifted. What had started as a joke was becoming something else entirely, something uncomfortable, something real. The bus driver, an older man who had been watching through the mirror, finally spoke up. "Son, let me tell you something. You think you've got the world figured out, don't you?" The teenager rolled his eyes but said nothing. The driver continued, his voice steady. "I've seen kids like you before. Acting tough, trying to prove something. But life has a way of humbling the proud." The bus slowed at a red light, and the old woman leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And when that moment comes, you'll wish you had listened." The boy swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He wanted to say something, anything to regain control of the situation, but for the first time, words failed him. His friends avoided his gaze, no longer laughing, no longer supporting his performance. The bus began moving again, but the air inside was different now. The weight of unspoken lessons, of stories untold, pressed against the teenager's chest. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, not with anger, but with something worse, expectation. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do. The teenager sat stiffly, his bravado slipping like sand through his fingers. He could still feel the weight of the elderly woman's words, the knowing looks from the passengers, the way the bus driver had spoken as if he had seen this story play out 100 times before. But what unsettled him the most wasn't their reactions, it was his own. For the first time in a long while, he felt small. His friends, who had once been entertained by his taunts, were suddenly distant, their laughter replaced with uncomfortable silence. One of them shifted in his seat and cleared his throat, as if trying to break the tension, but nothing could erase what had just happened. The boy clenched his fists, staring down at his shoes. He hated this feeling, this sense of exposure. It was as if the old woman had seen straight through him, past the jokes, past the arrogance, past the walls he had built. He wanted to brush it off, laugh again, pretend none of it mattered, but something inside him knew that wouldn't work this time. The bus rattled to the next stop, and a few passengers got off. The city outside continued as usual, cars honking, people rushing along sidewalks, life moving forward. But inside the bus, time still felt suspended, as if something had changed. The teenager felt a nudge on his shoulder. He turned to see one of his friends, someone who had been laughing the loudest just minutes ago, now looking at him with hesitation. "Hey, man, maybe you should chill," his friend mumbled. "It was just a joke." The boy frowned. Was it? Had it been? The old woman adjusted the grocery bag in her lap, her wrinkled fingers tightening slightly around the handles. She could feel the shift in the air, but she didn't press further. She had said what she needed to say. Now it was up to him. The boy took a deep breath, glancing toward the window. The buildings blurred past, and for a fleeting second, he wished he could be anywhere else. But there was no escaping this moment, no undoing what had been said. Then, to his own surprise, he did something he never thought he would do. He looked up at the old woman. His voice was quieter now, stripped of sarcasm. "What? What did that boy lose?" The elderly woman studied him for a moment, her gaze holding something almost gentle. She had been waiting for this. "A friend," she said simply. The words landed heavy in the boy's chest. He expected a long speech, some drawn-out lesson, but somehow, that single sentence carried more weight than anything else she could have said. He swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" The woman sighed, her eyes distant, as if seeing something that no one else could. He had a friend. Someone who cared about him. Someone who tried to warn him before it was too late. The teenager stayed silent. "But he didn't listen," she continued. "He thought he knew everything. Thought he was stronger, smarter. Thought the world revolved around him." She exhaled softly. And then, one day, that friend was gone. The boy's fingers twitched against his jeans. "Gone?" The woman nodded. "An accident. A moment of arrogance, just like this one." He laughed it off, ignored the warnings, and in the blink of an eye he lost someone who could never be replaced. The bus was so quiet now that even the sound of the tires against the road seemed distant. The teenager felt his throat tighten. He had never lost anyone before. Not really. Sure, people came and went, friends moved away, relationships changed, but this was different. This was final. For the first time, he thought about his own friends, the ones sitting beside him, ones who had always followed his lead, always laughed at his jokes, always encouraged his behavior. Would they always be there? Would he push them too far one day? Would his arrogance cost him more than just a few awkward glances from strangers? His mind flashed back to an argument he had with his best friend a few weeks ago. It hadn't seemed like a big deal at time, but now, in this moment, he wondered, had he been pushing too hard? Had he been too cruel? Was he already losing people without realizing it? He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. He hesitated, the words foreign on his tongue. I didn't mean anything by it. The elderly woman gave him a small, knowing smile. Maybe not. But words have weight, young man. And so do actions. The bus slowed again, and she began to gather her things. The teenager watched as she shifted in her seat, her movements slow but steady. He didn't know why, but suddenly, he didn't want her to leave just yet. Wait, he blurted out. He wasn't even sure what he was going to say. She paused, looking at him expectantly. His mind scrambled. He wasn't ready to apologize. Not yet. He wasn't even sure he knew how. But there was something else, something deeper that he wanted to say. What happened to the boy? He asked. The woman studied him for a moment before standing. He grew up, she said simply. And he spent the rest of his life wishing he could go back and do things differently. The boy felt his chest tighten. As the woman made her way toward the exit, the bus driver glanced at the teenager through the rearview mirror. Think about it, kid, he said. Before you end up with regrets, too. The doors hissed open, and the old woman stepped off the bus, disappearing into the city crowd. The teenager sat there, staring at the empty seat where she had been. His friends were unusually quiet beside him, and for once, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. He turned to look out the window, his own reflection staring back at him. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't like what he saw. The bus continued down the road, but inside him, something had changed.